This is Chapter 2 of the second part of Listen Humanity, entitled The Cycle of Sleep and Waking. To sleep is to surrender to one of the primary forces of life. Sleep is an inescapable need. There can be no substitute for it, although adjustment within certain degrees to its demands is possible, such as choosing 11 o'clock instead of 10 for retiring. Such adjustments can be made only within well-defined limits. There can be no tampering with the strict requirements for sleep over any considerable length of time. For the average man, prolonged abstention from sleep inevitably results in bodily disorder, as well as impairment or even derangement of the mind. The mind loses its normal alertness and deteriorates markedly in its ability to concentrate and work out abstruse problems. Further, it loses its ability to cope with the problems presented by everyday life. Sleep, being one of the most significant phenomena in the existence of the individual, must be thoroughly understood if the purpose of life itself is to be fully comprehended. Any attempt to give an explanation of sleep in purely physiological terms will be incomplete and misleading as well. Many people consider sleep to be the inevitable result of the exhaustion of the higher nerve centers of the brain. Some attribute the cause of sleep to the accumulation of metabolic and other deterioration products in the brain. Others regard sleep as the product of the inhibition of higher brain centers by nerve impulses generated in specialized sleep centers. Still other authorities regard sleep as the natural condition of the brain, and they consider consciousness to be the result of activating the brain through external stimuli. Sleep, in their opinion, is therefore a relapse into the natural state of the brain, which occurs on withdrawal of these external stimuli. The essence of all these physiological explanations is that sleep is a byproduct of the physical brain. This is a radically wrong conclusion. A more profound interpretation is required to do justice to the real status of consciousness and its relation to body and soul. Throughout evolution, consciousness is developed in and through the mind and expressed through the evolving medium of physical form, but consciousness itself resides in the soul. The body is only the medium through which consciousness expresses itself. Throughout the ages, a single life impulse, individualized soul, gradually becomes more conscious as it expresses itself through a myriad of forms. The consciousness thus developed is the possession of the mind, and it does not vanish with the disappearance of the physical vehicle. The physical form also evolves as consciousness unfolds. Bodily forms emerge one after another in continuous and ascending order, so that the total consciousness might develop progressively through a fitting progression of form vehicles. Consciousness is not a coincidental product of physiological processes, but the very reason for the existence of all forms. Consciousness is the standard by which the distinctions between sleep and waking should be understood. In wakefulness, the mind becomes conscious and expresses itself through the body. In sleep, the mind relapses into a quiescent state of the soul without outer expression. Physiologically, states of sleeping and waking may be described as the retarding and accelerating of the higher brain centers, but they are more significantly defined as the submerging and emerging of consciousness. In order to answer the basic question of why consciousness should oscillate between the quiescent state of sleep and the active state of wakefulness, one must attack the problem of the primary origin of consciousness. Before the beginning of all beginnings, the infinite ocean of God was completely self-forgetful. The utter and unrelieved oblivion of the self-forgetful, infinite ocean of God in the beyond state was broken in order that God should consciously know his own fullness of divinity. It was for this sole purpose that consciousness proceeded to evolve. Consciousness itself was latent in the beyond state of God. Also latent in the same beyond state of God was the original whim, lahar, to become conscious. It was this original whim which brought latent consciousness into manifestation, form, for the first time. Slowly and tediously, consciousness approaches its apex in the human form, which is the goal of the evolutionary process, and thereby an individual mind gradually differentiates itself from the sea of oblivion. However, the conscious individual still does not comprehend the truth of the real self. On the contrary, there is produced in man a false sense of limitation and frustration. The full consciousness that is laboriously produced in the evolutionary process and that takes the place of utter forgetfulness remains finite because it is replete with countless impressions, samskaras, of fulfilled and unfulfilled desires that have been acquired while inhabiting the many finite bodies. Originally, it was the lahar that caused consciousness to manifest. In everyday life, it is the impressions, samskaras, that cause latent consciousness in the sleep state to manifest itself as active consciousness in the awake state. Although the sea of oblivion has been swept back through the development of consciousness, yet it has been exchanged for a growing nightmare of ever-increasing futility. Forgetfulness has been displaced by remembrance, but it is a remembrance charged with limitation, helplessness, and binding desires. The full but finite human consciousness struggles to find self-expression and self-gratification, but even these efforts are subject to the sanskaric compulsions. They prevent man from recapturing the original truth of his being and subject him to increasing limitation and helplessness. He is like a spider caught in a web of his own making. As a means of respite, consciousness seeks the oblivion of deep sleep, where it again surrenders itself temporarily to the sea of self-forgetfulness, the original beyond state of God. In sound sleep, consciousness becomes latent for the time being, until the burden of unspent sanskaras forces it to manifest again in the awake state. In his desperate attempts during wakefulness to overcome his feeling of helplessness and boredom, man may attempt to escape from himself through the exciting emotions of lust or anger. Although drowning oneself in lust or anger may seem to promise escape, the satisfaction achieved is only temporary. Inevitably, a strong countersense of remorse or depression is induced that is worse than the original sense of frustration. On the collective level, wars provide the exciting avenue of escape that subsequently reacts to numb the spirit of man with an overwhelming sense of burden. Nature has striven to evolve consciousness through long ages of painful struggle. It is a great tragedy that when consciousness faces an acute need to free itself of entanglement, it should regress instead by resorting to the deadening of sensibility. This expedient is disastrous because it involves a conscious attempt to undo the achievements of natural evolution. None of man's waking attempts to overcome his feeling of intolerable weariness is wholly acceptable to the soul. All are dissatisfying in the long run. Hence, man seeks rest and refreshment by withdrawing temporarily into the oblivion of deep sleep. This psychological necessity for sleep cannot be avoided. Just as the physical body requires alternating periods of activity and rest, so the mind also needs such periods. Sleep is the means by which the mind withdraws temporarily from the pressure exerted by its age-old load of impressions and desires. Through sleep, the mind refreshes itself temporarily for further participation in the game of becoming self-conscious. If the self were completely aware of its true God nature during waking consciousness, it would find no need to withdraw into the self-forgetfulness of sleep. Its spontaneous joy would be an eternal wellspring of divine refreshment. When man seeks freedom from the ennui of the waking state by losing consciousness in the sleep state, no slightest destruction of consciousness occurs. Deep sleep is an inward withdrawal of consciousness into a condition of temporary oblivion. In this state, the mind is completely quiescent. It does not experience the helplessness of finite self-consciousness, nor is it aware of the true self as the illimitable truth. Both the finite illusory world and the real infinite state are forgotten as consciousness sinks into the sea of oblivion. In deep sleep, consciousness exists merely as a latent possibility, which must again be aroused to activity. Sleep stands in the same relationship to consciousness as death does to life. Death is not the annihilation of life, but its transference to another state of being. In the same way, sleep is not the annihilation of consciousness, but its withdrawal into a state of abeyance. Whether latent as unconsciousness or manifested as consciousness, consciousness is always there. The matter may be summarized as follows. After going to sleep, when man ordinarily enters the ordinary dream state, A, he has no consciousness of the body. B, the link with the physical body remains intact. C, pain and pleasure are experienced for a short period. D, the man wakes up in the same physical body. After physical death, man also enters the dream state, and A, he has no consciousness of the body. B, the link with that particular physical body is snapped for good. C, because the link with the gross no longer exists, he experiences pain or pleasure, the states of hell or heaven, far more intensely, whether for a long or short period. D, he wakes up in the gross in another physical body. The passage from sleep to wakefulness consists in the passage from A, unconsciousness, to B, subconsciousness, and finally to C, full consciousness. Normally, for the ordinary man, these consist of A, sound sleep equals unconsciousness. B, dreams equal subconsciousness of duality. C, roused from sleep equals full consciousness of duality. When a man almost loses consciousness, as in high fever, he is subconscious, as in the dream state. But if he is rendered unconscious through drugs such as chloroform, he is unconscious, as in the sound sleep state. Unconsciousness always involves temporary return to the original beyond state of God, regardless of the cause, whether it be sound sleep, drugs, or a physical accident. Although the subject of the path and its disciplines is considered in detail later, it is of interest to note in this connection that for those on the path, the three states are A, beyond state of God equals unconsciousness. B, experiences on the path equals real subconsciousness of duality. C, roused from all illusion of duality equals real full consciousness of God or self. Mind seeks the abeyance of its consciousness in deep sleep, but it cannot continue indefinitely to accept this self-refutation. This negative achievement is not an adequate substitute for the final purpose for which consciousness came into existence, that is, for the soul to become fully conscious of itself as the infinite truth. Though man attempts through sleep to escape the burden that consciousness imposes upon him, he is involuntarily drawn back to his waking state by the impressions gathered in the achieving of the very consciousness from which he sought escape. The old bonds of desires, both fulfilled and unfulfilled, bind him to the world of illusion and propel him again into the maelstrom of finite life. Although it is only temporary, sleep does give psychological reinvigoration to the mind. If there were not some kind of restoration of psychic vitality during sleep, there would be no particular benefit to this oblivion. In spite of the apparent respite, consciousness would remain exactly as it had been at the time of its withdrawal into sleep, and no special gain would be achieved. It would be merely a fruitless interval in a long chain of automatic responses to environment. Sleep does confer positive benefit, due to the fact that the separate I consciousness is in complete abeyance during deep sleep. The individual soul is in actual union with the infinite self. When sleep is dreamless, the individual soul is resting in the undisturbed tranquility of the most original, beyond state of God. But inasmuch as sleep is a submergence of consciousness into oblivion, it does not bestow upon the soul the conscious realization of the truth that the soul will eventually experience when consciousness is freed of all impressions, good as well as bad. Even this unconscious contact with infinity, the abode of all bliss and power, gives to the mind a new tone and vigor. When consciousness returns to waking functioning, it manifests a renewed faith that at some time, in some manner, a final solution to life's complexities will be found. Although the most important work of consciousness is always done during the waking state, dreams also play their part in helping consciousness through the maze of problems which beset it. As a rule, consciousness passes through the dream state during the transition from waking to sleep and while returning from sleep to waking. The dream state serves as a bridge between sleep and waking, but it is not an inevitable phase. The mind may swing between quiescence and waking without subconsciously passing through the dream phase. In the dream state, consciousness is not completely dormant, as in sleep, nor is it fully active, as in waking. The dream state is midway between these two phases, and it marks a transition from latent consciousness to active consciousness. The unique virtue of the ordinary dream state is that experiences in it are relatively free from the act of willing, as well as from the rigid social demands which prevail in conscious life. Despite the seeming lawlessness of the dream state, it is nevertheless subject to the accumulated mental and emotional impressions, sanskaras, which function as inexorably in the dream state as in the waking. Many inclinations and desires which cannot find fulfillment in waking life seek and find gratification in the self-created subjective world of dreams. Likewise, many fears and conflicts buried in the subconscious mind inflict upon the dreamer a diversity of suffering which the conscious mind would seek to avoid. Thus, dreamland also invites the experiencing of the opposites. The unique characteristic of dream experiences is that they afford an opportunity to work out a number of the sanskaric impressions without creating any new physical bondage. Many dreams have the same force and directive value that inhere in experiences of the waking state, but these latter are always accompanied by the simultaneous creation of new emotional and mental impressions, sanskaras, that prove to be just as binding as the age-old impressions that limit man's consciousness. Dream experiences, however, result in no such creation of further bindings. Another interesting aspect of ordinary dreams is that, regardless of what the dream entails, it has no direct effect upon any mind other than the dreamer. This is quite contrary to experiences in the conscious waking state. These invariably involve and affect many other souls as well, thus complicating many life patterns. The activity of consciousness in the waking state creates a bondage of karmic liabilities and assets from which dream experiences are exempt. The dream world is a type of psychic experimental laboratory, insulated from the demands of physical life, and thus possessing some advantage over the waking state. But because it does not give play to the directive faculty of the will and isolates the individual soul from other souls, it also suffers severe handicaps from which the waking life is free. In spite of the periodic release and refreshment that deep sleep supplies, the mind continues to be dissatisfied. Driven by need to escape from the burden that finite consciousness imposes upon him, man associates himself with like-minded individuals. By merging himself in a group that has similar problems, he hopes to fortify himself against his growing sense of dissatisfaction. But his hope is ill-founded. He finds no more redemption by identifying himself with the false we than by identifying with the false I. The increased strength of the group is nullified by increased expectations. Instead of finding his powerlessness mitigated, the individual finds that it is merely shared by many others. His sense of helplessness is accentuated through participation in the group consciousness, for he shares their collective feeling of helplessness as well as his own. Although occasionally a means may be found to eliminate some one worry in life, the final solution to recurring problems remains to be found. Suppose, for example, that a man is extremely miserable because others in his office seem to be given better treatment than he. Then, suppose that he is suddenly relieved of all his worries by inducing in himself a studied indifference to his surroundings. This may give him a temporary feeling of release from his problems, but since his troubles are really caused by lack of understanding of himself and environment, his cultivated indifference really leaves the situation completely unchanged. Sooner or later, when his forced indifference cracks and he again becomes emotionally involved, his old worries return to disturb him as before. His attitude of detachment fails to effect a permanent change in his consciousness because it is not based upon the truth that there is but one infinite self, which is the self of all. To know oneself honestly and understand one's environment requires a radical change in outlook. Mechanical coercion of the mind into a temporary attitude is not sufficient, for the mind has a tendency to revert to its age-old inclinations, habit patterns, sanskaric patterns, and to free itself from any position into which it may have been forced. Unless the mind achieves intelligent discrimination based on lasting values, it is inevitably harassed by its self-created worries. Again and again, man must seek the oblivion of sleep as a necessary respite from participation in things of little satisfaction. Man clings to the palliative experiences of the gross world even though they augment the very worries, sufferings, and defeats from which his consciousness desires to escape. Only in the extremity of despair does consciousness gather sufficient momentum to try to break through the constricting web of ego life and into the life of lasting freedom. When man realizes at last that his helplessness is the product of his countless cravings, he tries to find peace by renouncing those cravings and accepting life in a spirit of resignation to the divine will. Until that moment of supreme self-determination occurs, however, he finds himself persistently haunted by an overpowering desire to perpetuate his self-created ego life. Although he tries desperately to break through the self-centered isolation that this life fosters, it is only when he surrenders to a perfect master that he is initiated, sooner or later, into the path of redemptive love. Surrender to the will of the master is in itself very difficult, but it becomes more so under the gaze of friendly onlookers. To them, the actions of the spiritual aspirant often seem incomprehensible, as if he were sacrificing his most precious possession, his free will. Often it seems to the onlooker that the master aims only to increase his own prestige by directing the actions of those who surround him. This falls far short of understanding the work of the master. Just as it is necessary for solder to be fluxed in a salt before it can join the two metal parts together, it is necessary for the soul of the seeker to be bathed through self-surrenderance in the light that the master affords. The master gains nothing. It is not his purpose to gain. Certainly his ego cannot be exalted, for if he is a perfect master, he has already lost it. When a man determines to find peace and fulfillment through the renunciation of the cravings of the ego life, he finds that his new decision is challenged more by the deep-rooted compulsions of his own mind than by any obstructive factors in external environment. Although he now longs to love the master wholeheartedly as the divine beloved and tries to surrender completely to him, he is far from being master of his own mind. He cannot even surrender the things he regards as his own, despite his sincere decision. Like Janus, the aspirant has two faces, one looking longingly at truth, the other at ignorance. On the one hand, the aspirant yearns for the saving grace of the master and to be completely lost in the unbounded truth that he senses in the master. On the other hand, his false separative ego tries to perpetuate its existence by all available means. But with the first surrender to the master, the death knell of the ego life is sounded, and though it continues to struggle for survival, its days of dominance are numbered. If a person is caught in a quagmire, he instinctively tries every means to get out of it, but the very effort he makes thrusts him deeper into it. The more he struggles, the further in he sinks. Help must come to him then from someone who stands on firm ground, and who can only be of help when the struggling man has ceased to struggle long enough to look about for aid. There is a certain similarity between this situation and the case of the individual who has surrendered his life to the master. The false separative ego tries its utmost to postpone its own dissolution by resisting the divine love of the master. It struggles in the quagmire of existence, but each act of ego affirmation invites a reaction of deeper surrender to the beloved's will. This in turn brings with it the clear realization of the master as being none other than the irresistible truth that is the self of all selves and the one reality in the apparent multiplicity of individual souls. Truth realization is born of such complete surrender to the engulfing love of God, of which the master is the physical symbol and the channel. The finite self has now not only recognized itself as hopelessly limited, but also as utterly false. It ceases to make any claims or to protest in its own right, offering itself instead to the infinite truth. This offering of purified will redounds to its own advantage. When finite consciousness of the mind, in its stark awareness of futility and falseness, capitulates wholly to the infinite truth, the soul becomes consciously one with that truth in self-realization. Only then can consciousness be said really to have arrived at its final destination. Originally absorbed in the infinite, consciousness is now absorbed by the infinite, now consciously experiencing its own unlimited power, knowledge, bliss, and scope. In being absorbed by the infinite, consciousness is completely freed of one and all illusions and can be called super consciousness, in which state its former unlimited helplessness is transmuted into unlimited power. The aim of life and the real goal of all creation is to achieve true self-consciousness. When the mind of man is transformed into superconsciousness of the soul, it inherits the treasure of omnipotence, and there is no recurrence of that sense of helplessness that had haunted his dreaming and waking states. No longer is there need for consciousness to be submerged into the oblivion of sleep in order to achieve unconscious union of the self with the universal self. The conscious union that the individual self has now established with the universal self is an unfading attainment that persists forever. In the unlimited abundance of superconsciousness, the freed soul experiences no curtailment or cessation. In superconsciousness, the soul experiences itself as almighty. Its bliss is unbounded, and its continuous awareness of itself as the infinite truth admits no slightest interruption by the self-forgetfulness of the ordinary sleep, dream, or wake state. Ordinary waking consciousness of the mind is not only incapable of realizing the true self, but is deluded to accept the false limited self and the false multiplicity of the phenomenal world as real. It is therefore a form of ignorance. Superconsciousness may be termed supra-waking, because this state has transcended all normal limitations and has become truly whole in the sense that it retains no element of illusion. It is the opposite of ordinary sleep, for oblivion of the truth is complete in ordinary sleep, while awareness of truth is complete in superconsciousness. When waking consciousness invades and consciously illumines the depths of forgetfulness, ignorance, and illusion, it becomes transmuted into supra-waking consciousness.